All right. Okay, so welcome everyone. We are so excited to be here with you today. I will be presenting, but Tedra is going to start us up with some of her intros.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Tedra Jackson. I work for the Michigan Developmental Disabilities Council, and I was asked by the conference organizers to recommend someone, a speaker, to do a session at the MiPeer Conference on implicit bias. And I could not think of a better person other than my colleague, Yesenia Murillo, who I have been working with for the last 5 to 6 years on a community of practice in cultural and linguistic competence that's looking at systems change and how to make systems change in that arena for people with developmental disability. So people with developmental disability specifically, we're looking at in the behavioral health system, which just so happens to be where our peer mentors in Michigan come from. Yesenia is a senior equity analyst at MDHHS, and she developed a training. She was part of a team that developed a 2-day, 16-hour training for department employees titled Inside Our Minds. And from that training, they have sprouted smaller or shorter rather presentations really aimed at helping to introduce this subject into get it out there to people working in healthcare. And so I give you now Ms. Yesenia Murillo, and she is going to you will be hearing mostly from her today, and I am happy to be supporting her because she has all the knowledge that you need to really advance yourselves in this area, or to start. This is an introduction. From 16 hours to an hour and 15 minutes, we're going to get you started, and we're sure that Pam and Tracy will continue to implement more work in more of this topic in the work that you all are doing. Yesenia.
Thanks, Tedra. It's my pleasure to be here. Implicit bias is definitely one of my go-to topic areas as a specialist in diversity, equity, and inclusion. And I had the pleasure of leading the development of the 2-day workshop that Tedra was talking about. So I won't say more except that equity is really what gives me life. Equity work, the work of reducing oppression and trying to also reduce disparate outcomes is what I've been doing for about 13 years. And so it's a pleasure to be in front of you talking about this very important and critical subject, implicit bias. Today, we're going to discuss implicit bias in the media and healthcare. So with that, let me tell you a little bit about where I work and how special we are. Well, I think this is the Office of Race, Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion. We were actually just established recently, right before the pandemic. It was almost like we knew the pandemic was going to hit. And we had executive leadership support, and we also have an MDHHS DEI council that supported the development and structuring of this office. We were created to address racial, social, health, and wealth disparities, both internally and externally. And everything we do stems from work of race equity and anti-racism. We don't do it exclusively, so we believe that it is important to understand that race touches all of our different outcomes in society, and there is also a lot of intersectional oppression. So intersectional marginalized identities is something that we care deeply about and prioritize in our work as well. And we have 3 divisions. Equity Development Division is where I work, and Leadership Development is another area. And then we have the Office of Equity and Minority Health, which has more than 3 decades of experience doing equity work for minority populations. And I used to work for them right before coming to Equity Development. So definitely seeing me smile because I'm very proud of what we do. So let's get into the course objectives. Today, we're going to walk away being able to define implicit bias, recall a shared language. And this probably won't happen just by you being in today's session. You will have to practice some afterwards, right? But it will begin to create this process where you can recall an understanding of these concepts. Understand and describe the impact of implicit bias in healthcare and the media, and then walk away with strategies to reduce implicit bias. Here we have some community agreements. That's what we call them internally. And community agreements are used for having sometimes what may seem delicate conversations, right? Not everyone is very comfortable talking about subject matters of implicit bias, social justice, oppression, and things of this nature. So we create these guidelines or agreements to share space with one another. To begin, we have practice both and thinking. And this is the idea that two opposing, what seems to be opposing ideas can coexist at the same time. So for example, easy, where you can laugh and cry at the same time. That may seem opposing, but who has, raise your hand, whether, you know, on the screen or your virtual hand, who has laughed and cried at the same time? Okay, great. Thanks, William and Tony. Great. So this is it. Giving us permission to have those two seemingly opposed things coexist. And that's very important for this work. Focus on understanding versus agreeing or disagreeing. We have this tendency in US culture to agree to disagree. That's even a saying that I learned, right? Or to agree or disagree. And that limits us a little bit when we automatically by default want to agree or disagree with something. We're already making up our minds about something. We're not trying to stay alert and listen intently to be able to understand what the other individual or group of people is telling us, right? So what we want to do today is walk away from disagreeing or agreeing and try to stay in the understanding mode. Try to just listen, take a deeper dive into what someone is saying, how they're thinking, what they're believing, and how they're expressing their experience. Try on doesn't mean take it on. It doesn't mean that you have to agree or to like or to adopt something, right? It means that you just have to try it on. I know I have, for example, very colloquial example. I have gone shopping and I see a piece of clothing that I'm like, no, it doesn't call me. But for some reason, I try it on. Maybe my friend told me, just try it on, just see if you like it. You never know. And then I fell in love with it, right? We don't know what we don't know until we try. So that's what we want to practice today, even in the space of discomfort. When we are uncomfortable, we tend to walk away from that discomfort. And so we're saying today, we're inviting you to stay in that discomfort for just a moment and stretch yourself a little bit. It may be after you try it on, maybe it can fit you later. Notice intent and impact. This is about knowing that most individuals in society have a good intent, right? We all want to do good for others and do good for ourselves. That, however, doesn't always translate to the impact, the outcome, the results that we have, especially when it comes to other people. And sometimes not even to ourselves, right? So be responsible for the impact of your words and your actions and take accountability. So let's say I'm rushing because I'm late to my appointment, and on the sidewalk, as I was rushing and running, I stepped on someone, right, that was just sitting there, maybe at a bus stop. Well, my responsibility is to stop and to, even if I'm rushing, even if I'm going to be late to my commitment, to ask, are you okay? What can I do to remedy that I stepped on you, right? And that's a metaphor that I really like for this type of work, because sometimes we don't even realize that we stepped on someone, but we have. And it is our responsibility to be able to listen and to identify that we stepped on someone and ask, what can I do? How can I repair this, right? And then lastly, lean in and lean out. And this has two meanings. The first is about participation, because we know that we have introverts, extroverts, or ambiverts, which live like in the middle. But extroverts tend to lean in a lot. They're okay with expressing their minds and talking about their feelings, right? Very open and public. And introverts may not always be up for the challenge or up for talking out loud about the things that they're thinking or believing. And so obviously we want to balance that out. But also in the subject of social justice, we know historically that voices have been silenced in the past. And those voices are the voices of people of color. They're the voices of marginalized communities such as women, LGBTQ, people with disabilities, etc. Right? So we want to allow those voices to lean in to the conversation and to be heard. And that's the invitation of today. So that is all I have. Those are the 5, if I'm not, yep, 5. I thought I was miscounting. 5 agreements that we have for today. So if you believe that these agreements are okay, I would like you to raise your hand or put in the chat, yes, I agree to follow. And if you have a conflict, you can speak up about it, or perhaps there's something that I missed that you think, oh, I wish Yesenia talked about this because that's important to me in this dialogue. Please let me know as well. You can open your mic or you can drop it in the chat. Okay, I see a lot of hands. Thank you for that. Okay.
So Yesenia, as you are just checking the hands to make sure that we have an agreement before we move on, the polling feature is not enabled currently. We are trying to look into that and do some problem solving. So when we get to the slide 6, we may have to just do a show of hands or ask people to type in the chat or unmute. And also for the audience, we are going to take questions by section. So we don't want you to hold them all the way until the end, but just as we move through sections, Yesenia will stop and ask if there are any questions periodically. Thank you.
Thank you, Tedra. All right, thanks so much, everyone who raised their hands. I don't see any opposing views in the chat, and I did not hear any additions. So I will take that as we're ready to roll. We're ready to get into the content, and you can lower your hands now so that I don't think you have a question. And we're going to dive into the first section. So the first section is talking about that language that we want to share with one another, establish a common understanding of these terms that we're using so that we can talk to each other. And that is essentially why we always start with shared language, because sometimes we assume that terms are used in a conversation similarly or in the same way, and that everyone is clearly understanding what we're saying, right? We spend a little time asking for clarifications, or sometimes we don't even say anything because we may be shy or embarrassed. And that, without really realizing, that can take us into difficult waters, because maybe we are misunderstanding one another. Maybe we get to a point where we said, oh, I wish I had clarified this point like 2 conversations ago, because we're here now. We have a misunderstanding, or we have a disagreement. And ultimately, we say that in difficult conversations, it's not that the topic is as difficult, is that maybe the communication is difficult, right? Maybe we are not understanding one another because we are layered in multiple cultures, right? And we each speak from our own vantage point of cultures, and that's plural. We have very numerous cultures that we act according to. And so what we want to do to start is establish this common understanding of these terms. And this helps us keep away from silos, meaning that people are working separate from one another, share a way to communicate, and not only communicate, but if we have understanding, then we can walk into actions, right? Resolutions. And also understanding that this is not stagnant. Language is never static. Language is evolving. So today we're learning something that maybe, hopefully not, so you don't have to continue to relearn every so often, but maybe a week from today, it changes. I don't think that is as related to this topic as it is to other topics that are more fluid. For example, LGBTQ, I think of that as very fluid language. But it does change and it does evolve. So we also have a responsibility to stay on top of how that community speaks about those terms and concepts used inside of the community, right? That we are responsive to that. Okay, so let's get into the first question, and I understand the polling is not working. So we were going to poll, are you biased? And the answers that you can give are yes or no. So can you type in the chat, yes or no? Thanks, Alicia, for being the first one. Are you biased? Yes or no? Don't feel like afraid. This is a non-judgmental. That's something that we didn't have in the agreements, but non-judgmental space, virtual space. Okay, answers are coming in. They keep coming. Great, thanks. Perfect. I see there was, okay, still some. There was a slight stop. Keep them coming and I'll continue to talk. So the answer is yes. I don't want you to be confused, but most people react with a no to this question, especially when seeing it for the first time. Perhaps this is not your first rodeo. You've already done some of your work. And the challenge is that bias has really strong definitions. If you do a quick dictionary search, you will find bias is synonym of bigotry, intolerance, unfairness, etc. And bias is unconscious too, right? And so we have synonyms of unconscious as implicit, comatose, paralyzed, insensible, and senseless. So having that list of synonyms, who would like to be associated with these terms? I don't think many people would. So people ultimately don't want to admit that we are all biased. All of us have biased behaviors and biased ideas inside of us. And bias is associated as well with a lot of prejudice historically. So that conflicts with our US constitutional commitment to fairness and justice for all, right? So there's a lot of opposing ideas happening when we see bias and when we call it out, when we name it. There's a lot of dissonance. Dissonance is almost like having two opposing ideas at the same time. And so what I want to do is to rip the stigma away from bias. Bias is just a term, right? It is not the person. It is not the actions. It is not any of that. It's the term that helps us identify something very critical to this work. And so understand that we have to normalize conversations around bias, and we all have to admit that every human being is biased. If you have a brain, you are biased. Now, we're going to talk about some nuances of how that shows up, right? How each of us may show it up. But if there's one thing that I want you to walk away with today, and all of you said yes, I think, yeah. So I think that I don't even have to say this point, but it's part of the training, is that we all have to accept and recognize bias. So thumbs up in a very positive manner, in a very educative way. Thumbs up if you are biased. If you can give me your reaction thumbs or your physical thumb. Great. All right. So here is the yes, and that's what we just ended with. Now let's talk about how bias actually shows up. And we're going to discuss schemas. So here we're going to get into the brain concepts, and we're going to get into social concepts. And this is something that I actually do every training, but it is even more important in this space today. Research, generally speaking, is very dominant culture. And so in this case, when we talk about the brain, we're talking about typical brains, neurotypical brains, not atypical brains. Unfortunately, that's a huge gap in this type of research that hasn't been met yet. And that's critical, right? Especially to this particular audience. I would love to have more conversations about this particular point with any of you who either have family members, friends, or are touched by this subject. And so having that disclaimer, knowing that we're talking about typical brains, we know that schemas are mental models. They're mental associations that every human being has. And they're part of our biology, meaning that all of us are born with this type of ability from a typical brain, right? And so in addition to having that biology, we also get fed or are socialized into schemas. And we're going to break them up now. So let's talk about the first way that schemas or mental associations show up. So the brain first, we naturally categorize broad things such as animals, objects, behaviors, situational cues, and even humans to save energy and conserve mental resources. That's the purpose of this great ability that we have. It's actually to survive. It's a survival mechanism that we're able to navigate multiple things at once, right? Right now, I am not thinking that I'm necessarily in front of a computer because I already know that for a fact. I have already navigated virtual trainings for more than a few years, right? I'm not thinking that I'm sitting on a chair. If you are sitting, maybe you're standing, because it has already been normalized. But all of these things are happening at once, right? I'm not thinking that there are so many of you on the other side because I can't see you necessarily. I can see some of you on the side here, but not all of you. So we just operate, we behave according to all these things that we have already learned from being exposed to these things before, right? And that gives us the opportunity to save energy and just go with it and conserve energy for the things that we have not been exposed to, the things that we have not learned how to deal with, those things that are new and require a lot of energy, because those things do not work outside of your implicit categorization, your unconscious categorization. They will work through your explicit conscious brain, right? You have to really think explicitly what is happening with your conscious mind right now in order to make sense of something new. All right, so this is our great ability to make split decisions very quick based on these categories. Now, this isn't harmful by itself, right? This is actually, like I said, a great ability, something that we can do for the most part. But it is very interesting once we add the second kind of way that schema shows up, and that is socialization. Socialization is the information that we use to categorize, to fill in the blanks, all those mental associations that we have, right? So the social part of schemas is culturally rooted and socially conditioned. We continuously get fed information through society, and we create mental models as well based on that. The challenge is that the information is not always accurate, right? Sometimes it is based on prejudice. Sometimes it is based on misconceptions. It's based on stigmas. Sometimes it is based on thoughts without lived experience. Just thinking, oh, this seems to be right, right? And we make certain judgments about certain things. And we don't fact check everything. Sometimes we share information without fact checking things, right? And so that is where it is challenging to have schemas, to be able to make very quick decisions all of a sudden, right? Split-second decisions by default. And that's where we want to be really careful, that we are able to check ourselves and analyze if the information I'm using is serving me well and serving people, those people that we are interacting with well. One example of schemas that I wanted to leave you with is airports. How many of you have been to an airport? Yeah, thank you. Okay, I see some of you here. Perfect. So if you have been to an airport, most of them have the same structure, right? Maybe things are positioned differently in different places of the airport, but you know that there's labels. You know that labels have instructions and that they'll tell you where to go. You know that you have to do your check at first. You have to get your itinerary ticket. You have to drop your bags if you have any, and then go to security, right? And then after that, find your gate. So there's a process that if you have gone for the first time, it's repeating every time after that. And that's a schema. You don't have to concentrate to think, oh, what do I do next? It kind of happens automatically after you have done it the first time or even 2 or 3 times, right? So this is an example of a schema. And it is, like I said before, is without the social part being misinterpreted or misused when we share inaccurate information, when we share prejudice information or stigma, it is a great defense or survival mechanism. It is part of our flight, freeze, respond, or fight, respond, right? In order to survive. So it was used so much more, I think, in different ways that we use them now, but it has been used historically and it continues to be used today in order to detect harm and act accordingly, right? And so now, after all this talk, I want you to review what this video is telling you, because maybe the video speaks to you in a different way that Yesenia just spoke to you. So it's a 3-minute video about schemas made by University of California in Los Angeles. And then after the video, we'll debrief a little bit about what you heard. There's no sound yet. Let me know if the sound is coming.
Our brains are extraordinary. Think your smartphone's fast? Turns out your brain is a far more advanced computational machine.
Can't hear it. I can't hear it. I heard it in the beginning, but it was really low, and now I don't hear it at all.
Okay, let's try it again. Let me raise the volume. It's 100% volume, and let's see. And please speak out so that I'm able to troubleshoot.
Ordinary. Think your smartphone's fast? Turns out your brain is a far more advanced computational machine. We don't notice it, but our brains are constantly automatically processing millions of stimuli every second. For example, if you see me walking down the street, through casual visual inspection, you instantly sort me into multiple social categories, such as male, middle-aged, and Asian. Once you tag me in this way, your brain automatically activates a cloud of information that you've come to associate with each of these categories over the course of your life. All of this happens without any conscious direction, effortlessly, while you're doing other things such as walking your dog, drinking your coffee, dodging cars, and checking your phone. How do our brains perform such complex tasks in real time? We can't possibly attend to each bit of data individually. Instead, we make sense of this fire hose of information by chunking our world through mental schemas. Schemas are templates of knowledge that sort specific examples into broader categories. Think of a chair. When you enter a room and see something with a flat surface, a back, and some legs, you just know it's a chair. And in the instant that you've categorized that thing as a chair, you know how to interact with it. Even if you've never seen this particular chair before, you know exactly what it is and exactly what to do. You sit. Unless something goes wrong, schemas are activated through automatic mental processes. or cognitions that occur outside of our conscious awareness and largely beyond our control. In this sense, they are implicit cognitions. They are also absolutely essential. Without these mental shortcuts, we'd never be able to navigate the world around us, at least not without expending all of our mental resources, figuring out where to sit. For this reason, automatic mental processes, such as schemas, should generally be celebrated. It's a neat feature about our brains. Without them, we'd have no chance. But schemas don't apply only to things like chairs. They also apply to people, because in some sense, we're just interestingly complex things. That means automatic processes lead us to sort fellow human beings by schemas, including social categories such as age, role, sex, and race. Here's where things get interesting. We might not care about automatically processing chairs, but automatically processing people? If we want to treat people fairly so that we can all compete in a genuine tournament of merit, might these automatic processes lead us astray? Getting curious, skeptical, anxious? To learn more, turn to the next video, Implicit Bias, Lesson 2, Attitudes and Stereotypes.
Okay, so let's do a quick debrief, and I may only be able to get a couple of people to tell me what you took away, any learnings overall, or you might be able to answer this question based on what you have learned. How do you think we receive and internalize messages or information? What do you all think? How do we get information? Let me open up the chat. Okay. So what has been learned can be unlearned and relearned. Definitely. That's a great point, Terry. That's a great takeaway. Denise or Dennis. Not sure where the accent is there. Dennis. Okay. From the way we were brought up and by what we see. Definitely. From past experiences, changes, through observation and instruction, by reading, asking questions, and different resources. Definitely all of that. Thank you so much for participating. You all said some of the things I had here by smelling too, right? By feeling or touching, by hearing, by tasting. Sometimes our memory is related to a taste or a particular smell, and we can't describe it, but that's information we received. By seeing, definitely. By reading movies, ads, marketing, and even the sixth sense, by your gut feeling. Your gut is telling you something. So what we want to understand is that we are socialized with all this information at a very young age. It starts from 2 or 3 when we begin to actually think about, oh, this is what I was taught. There was a study really quick made by a couple, and I can't remember, a scientist couple. I can't recall their names right now, but it was a doll experiment, and they showed dolls to babies and infants and toddlers, I should say, not babies. And it was Black dolls, white dolls, and other racial or ethnic dolls. And they asked which one looks beautiful, to understand the concept of beauty for these toddlers and infants. And it was the white doll that looked beautiful. So this was an experiment that taught us so much about when do we as human beings begin to socialize information. And so it starts from a young age, but it's reinforced continuously through your lifetime every single day. And we have to be very mindful of that. Let's transition to some definitions, because I want you to have definitions of these two terms that we've been talking about, especially implicit bias, but the opposite of implicit bias is explicit. So I wanted you to have that comparison. So here, examining the difference between implicit and explicit, implicit bias are the attitudes or stereotypes that affect our understanding, actions, and decisions in an unconscious manner, right? We're not conscious of it. No consideration for alternative points of view are there. We don't think that there's an alternative. We think that is correct. And explicit bias are the attitudes and beliefs that we have about a person or group on a conscious level. We are fully aware of that belief or idea or judgment that we're making. Some examples come from the work of Daniel Kahneman. He authored a book called Thinking Fast and Slow, and he talks about the fast and slow brain. So the fast brain is implicit, right? Because as we were talking about, that's when you make split decisions, when you act according to all the information that is in your hard drive, if you were a computer, right? That it's stored in your memory bank. And this example is without knowing, maybe you sit further away from a Latino than a white person. And obviously we have to give context to this, right? Why is that happening? Is it happening because you were fed information? For example, in my case, I grew up outside, but came back to LA when I was 15, outside of the country, I meant to say. And at 15, I was taught a lot of my environment in Los Angeles, California. I used to live about 4 blocks away from a local gang. And people told me, you know, this is what they look like. This is how they dress. This is the radius, kind of like the entire section where they call, you know, their own territory and things of that nature. So in my case, the context is perhaps I saw a person on the bus that looked like they were part of that gang. And to be honest, at first I was afraid, right? As I came back to the United States, I wasn't surrounded by gangs before that. And I was afraid. So maybe unconsciously, I just said, let me just choose another seat. Or maybe I did it consciously, right? So it really has to do with your own flashlight, putting a light on what you're doing and asking yourself and recognizing how this behavior is being made. So that transitions us to slow brain, being very explicit, very conscious and aware of your evaluation and making a decision based on your own evaluation. So saying, I prefer to have white managers in my staff, or anything of that nature, or I prefer to have Black individuals in my track team because I think that they're going to win. Things of that nature that are based on stereotypes, you're making an evaluation and you act according to that evaluation. So that's the difference between slow and fast brain. Now, I hope you have enough information to do a quick knowledge check. We just talked about all of these terms, and I want to make sure that you walk away with increased understanding. So let's start on the right column. The first term, and I think the poll is still not working, so I'm just going to continue, Tedra. The attitudes and beliefs we have about a person or group on a conscious level. What is this? Please drop in the chat if this is implicit bias, schemas, or explicit bias. Dennis, you're on a roll today. Thanks for starting us. Yes, this is explicit. Thanks, Rachel and Terry. This is right. Conscious, right? Explicit. Let's go to the next. The attitudes or stereotypes that affect our understanding, actions, and decisions in an unconscious manner. What is this? Rachel, thanks. Bingo. In my culture, we would call bingo out. Okay, Rachel, you got it. Implicit bias, right? And then last, this helps us organize information into broader categories to conserve mental resources. They exist in and are shaped by our environment. What is this? Schemas, yes. Perfect. This is great. Okay, so I was adamant about the chat and forgot to give you the little visuals for those of us that are visual. Great. Okay, now let's talk a little bit more about socialization. And this work is coming from a very renowned researcher called Albert Bandura. His work on socialization has been cited more than 50,000 times. And he talks about socialization, through the social learning theory. And the theory was proposed in 1960, and it looks at the environment in which we're living and how we behave and interact with the world. And he suggests through the theory that behavior is learned through models or examples that we are exposed to as people. People learn best when watching someone modeling behavior. In general, we tend to get these messages from people that we appreciate and feel high esteem for, such as family or friends, or even individuals that you think highly of as maybe your director, your manager, maybe your pastor, anyone who you think highly of. And then we ask, okay, so how do we become aware of this, right? Because sometimes it just happens automatically. We're not necessarily aware that this is happening. And how do we create these models and translate them into our own actions, our own beliefs, our own thoughts and ideas? We are, for the most part, we are often told stories, right? Through written or verbal mediums by our elders, our family members. And this is a piece of how we practice socialization. This is one piece. This is a cultural practice, but it is one to highlight because it's very prevalent in society, and it helps us shape how we see social, cultural, and economic realities. Government is a huge influence here in the US as well of how we see these realities. News anchors are a huge influence as well. There's a lot of influences that we get. Sometimes socialization can happen in a way that is destructive and not constructive, and we have to be very mindful of that. One quick story that we share here is maybe a story that you have heard before about a family celebrating Thanksgiving. And the child noticed mom cutting the turkey into two parts and cooking it into two different pans. And the child asked mom, "Why are you cooking it this way?" And the mom's response was, "We have always done it this way," right? That's the answer. There's nothing else needed. The child wasn't satisfied though and asked, "But why? I don't understand why we have always done it this way." Mom didn't know what to say, so she inquired with grandmother, great-grandmother, and other family members. And finally, great-great-grand relative told her that the reason they cooked the turkey in two pans is because back then they didn't have money to afford a large enough pan to fit the whole turkey at once. And so it's interesting that they followed now a tradition, right, to split the turkey in half without the context, and that wasn't really put into the equation of why we practice this still today, and can we revise this practice. All right. To close this, Bandura's theory is not 100% accurate in explaining how we are socialized and how we interact with that socialization, because other theories came out after that suggesting that personality and traits, or even some genetic makeup, influences us as well, right? And so neither theory hits the mark totally, but I think all of this together is very important to understand the complexity of how we interact with the world and how nature versus nurture works together. To close this, we're going to think a little bit about this question: how have you internalized messages that shape you in ways that you don't even know about? So we're going to think a little bit, and as you think, I'll give you some more numbers if you are that type of person. Sometimes we like numbers and facts. So humans receive 11 million bits of information at once, 11 million. How many of those bits do you think we're consciously aware of? In every, we said information at once in 1 second. So how many of those do we think we're consciously aware of? Put it in the chat. Oh, I see TikTok. Less than 10%, 5 million, 1 or 2. Ooh, not many. Okay. Okay, I like the range of answers. So yes, we only receive 40 to 50 bits of information that we are consciously aware of. All the rest is part of our subconscious, and it just fits into all the information we have already known. Specifically, that is 85 to 90% of our daily tasks. So someone was very close saying 10%, right? Almost like on the money, are done on our unconscious level. 90% is done unconsciously. And in fact, our value system is conscious, right? We have values that we're very aware of, but our unconscious is mainly controlled by our biases. We don't always have a parallel between these two. This means that sometimes, even if your value system is X, Y, or Z, your action and behavior may not be aligned with that value system. And that's, again, a dissonance, right? That's like an opposing action that is happening within you, the same individual. And that's very important to the work that we do in implicit bias, understanding that that happens to all of us. So let's get into talking a little bit about contributions of implicit bias in healthcare. And I'm going to call out a few examples, and then we're going to talk about your own examples in the work that you do. So this is coming from the National Cultural Competency Center. And here we have some stats, but I just realized that we just went into another section. So I want to pause. I want to pause for a moment before giving you some of these stats. Any questions about that section that we covered? Any questions? No? Okay. Okay, pretty clear. All right, so let's get into it then. Let's get into some of these stats. First, we're starting with caregivers. So impact on the family caring for a child with special healthcare needs and linguistic access barriers. That's the first category here of how implicit bias shows up. So we know that 84.75% of children with special healthcare needs belong to families that speak primarily Spanish. 84.8% of Hispanic children in Spanish-speaking families live below the 199th poverty line, compared to 48.4% of Hispanic English-speaking households and 34% of non-Hispanic households. So those are just two examples. There's a lot of data that I'm happy to share if you're interested. The second category is single parenting and children with special healthcare needs. Here we have 61% of Black children with special healthcare needs live with a single mother, right? And usually that they live in 200% of the federal poverty line. I almost didn't say that right, but it came out right. Okay. And then the other stat here is 28% of single Black mothers of children with special healthcare needs who have had to cut back on working or stopped working due to the children's health needs. So a high percentage, very significant percentage of Black mothers have had to cut back on working or stopped working. And then lastly, poverty and education. So here we have 21.5% of children with special health care needs whose family members have less than a high school education had no usual source of sick or well care, in comparison with 13% of children whose family have graduated from high school. So that's very significant. And then 49% of individuals with less than a high school education are at below basic health literacy skills, and children with special health care needs who live in a household in which the adult caretaker has less than a high school education are about twice as likely to have one or more periods in the previous year without insurance, right? So there's a lot of that type of data. Now, I understand Tedra has taught me well in the work that I do with Tedra and the COP, the community of practice, that we don't have all the numbers data that we wish we had, right, for people with disabilities, but those are some numbers. Now, qualitatively, there's a lot of data. We know that, for example, immigrant and refugee families struggle to feel supported by the healthcare system once they're coming to a new homeland and have a child with a disability. They don't receive family-centered care. Parents report that they're not partners in decision-making once it has to do with their child's needs, etc. Reliable child care, etc. So there's a lot to consider here. And I wanted to now, we're going to skip this because most of those stats actually talked about what she's discussing from a Hispanic perspective. And I want to talk to you all. How does bias show up in the work that you do? I want to bring attention to you and learn from you now that we talked a lot about language and some examples. If I can have people open their mics, if you're comfortable with that. Oh, Terry, very wise. I just saw that. You saw the iceberg. So I have Rachel saying substance abuse stigma. Okay. If you can tell me a little bit more about that, that would be wonderful, because I'm learning from you now in this particular slide. And anyone else, there's a lot of bias. I bet. I can bet money. There's a lot of bias.
Yesenia, I know that Pam Werner had some really good examples when I was asked her a couple questions the other day. Maybe she would want to unmute and share with us.
Sure. A couple things that I did share is when people with a mental health issue show up to the ER, I have several people that have shared with me that as soon as they see in the chart their diagnosis, they're all of a sudden in a different room talking to a social worker, or they'll not be able to explain their symptoms and people will disregard what's happening with them based on labels. That was one that I shared. And I think there's a lot of bias in working with people with the homeless population or the general public and what they think about people who are homeless or houseless. You know, they don't want to work. They're living off the government, making a lot of comments about that, where if you go back and look at the slide that you showed about people in poverty, I believe it's more related to not being able to find safe and affordable housing and the lack of Section 8s. So those are a couple things that I thought about.
That's great. Thanks, Pam. And I think you had Eileen's chat very similar to that, mental health versus addictions. And Eileen, you say what you have seen is that people with the dual diagnosis will not talk about their mental health diagnoses, but only their addictions. Okay. Very interesting. And why is that? Can you talk a little bit about why you think, what's the bias in that?
I think that people with dual diagnosis are ashamed because of the way that people look at them. Me being a recovering addict myself, it took a long time for me to understand that I suffer from mental illness as well. And the mental illness part started first before the addiction started. And people don't want to admit that today.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much, William.
Mm-hmm. And I would agree with that. And I think another part of that is the way the media portrays people with a mental health condition. You know, all of a sudden there's a mass shooting and immediately they look at, well, you know, well, that person got services when they were 15 and the individuals, you know, in their 30s, and all of a sudden they have a diagnosis when maybe they have diabetes. Maybe they should do some correlation of other medical labels people have. And I just think that's a huge issue. And I think with substance use, there's a lot of biases about how people parent, but it's also with people with mental health conditions. Mm-hmm. And personally, I believe that, you know, children are removed based on some people's labels where I've heard that a lot. There's a national focus on how mothers with mental health issues have had children removed for less than what other people without a mental health condition have not.
I like to agree with what Pam was saying about the when there's a mass shooting, the first thing that the media is saying is that person has a mental health illness. I think that mental health is looked at as, it still has a stigma with it. Addiction is looked at as acceptable, whereas mental health is looked at as you have a problem. They don't look at a person with addiction as a person who has a major problem, as they look at, as America looks at, our society looks at a person with a mental illness as crazy. I think, you know, people get paranoid about being diagnosed with a mental illness because that's automatically telling them in their mind, based upon what they've been brought up and understanding and hearing, is that they are crazy. And if they have an addiction problem, it's that they're just a druggie. So I think that's a difference as well.
Hi, my name is Matt. I'm a peer mentor from Oakland County. And there's also bias with people with developmental disabilities. As myself having a developmental disability, sometimes people think we can't do things for ourselves because we are disabled. There's also another bias that because we have a disability, we can't do extra things in nighttime, if you know what I mean. I'm trying to keep it, PG here, but if you get what I mean, people think that we can't do certain things because of our disabilities, and that's not always true. And people also think like because we have a developmental disability, we can't think for ourselves, like when we go to the doctor's office. So they always directly go to the staff and say, the staff member, hey, well, what can you tell me about Matt? And they'll be like, Matt can talk for himself, So there's also biases within the developmental disability that's just huge. And I don't know how many people in here are from the developmental disability side, so I wanted to chime in and kind of spin that off to you guys as well.
Definitely. That's so
And
important.
Also, I just wanted to piggyback off of what Dennis just shared. Coming into this process, Pam was one of the trainers that I had when I first got certified in 2014. I don't know if she remembers me or not, but that word crazy, I hate that word. I was trained and taught that that's not a word that we use in mental health. There's a lot of other words that we can use, but crazy is not one of them, and I hear that word a lot in society today when it comes down to people with mental health. And, people don't understand that some people you can't even notice mental health in just by looking at them. It goes so much deeper than what somebody looks like. It's my mother always, when she introduces me to her friends, she says that, thank God he don't look like what he been through, And so it's deep when it comes to mental health. It's so much deeper than the words that we attach to it, if that makes sense to anybody.
Absolutely. Thank you. And I wanted to lift up Dell, who is also sharing in the chat. Eileen and Dell are having a little bit of an exchange there. So thank you for all of you, Dennis, Pam, William, Matt, Eileen, and Tony and Dell, who shared. I appreciate that very much. And it really brings reality to this training, right? That's probably the one slide that I love the most. It's to hear from you about how biases are creeping into our daily lives, right? And how they have a huge impact. So now that we went there, I don't want to leave you with that. I want to leave you with power tools to be able to reduce and confront those biases. So there are some practices that we're going to be discussing, and we do have very little time. So I will review them as quickly as I can. And I'm always available to speak after the training via email or get on the phone with you if you need it. So first, we have stereotype replacement. And this is one of the most useful tools that you can put into practice, because it really starts to shift the narrative, shift the story. It is not about the poor Black person who couldn't feed themselves, right? or who couldn't feed the family. It is not about that. It's about, for example, here, The Princess and the Frog. Princess Tiana is a strong, independent Black woman who is not interested in romance. She comes from a two-parent home, not a single-parent home, and is hardworking. Their family is hardworking, and eventually she becomes a business owner. So it's shifting. It's like replacing that stereotype with a positive reality, so that we start to think differently about those stereotypes that have been fed historically. Mulan is the left upper corner, and Mulan is challenged with gender stereotypes because she is a strong, self-propelled female hero or shiro character that takes on a man's role in her community that was considered a man's role, to fight in the war on behalf of her father, and does so so well, right? And fluidly through her gender roles throughout the movie. Then we have Encanto, the left bottom corner. It's a Disney movie about a magical family from Colombia. It explores different family dynamics. It explores the fact that Latinos come in all shades and all shapes, in all accents. There's so many accents in there. So really showcases diversity. And then we have what I think, you know, Black Panther. This is very, very popular. A Black cast with Black heroes that is supported by strong Black women, right? There's a Black woman army. Wakanda is the country, and it's not deprived. It's not a third world African country. It's a technology advanced nation saturated with intelligence. So that's how you flip it. You replace the stereotype. There's some real life examples here. I'm happy to give you some of this background information after, but it's the same thing. It's replacing, not thinking of an Indian man in very stereotypical ways, not thinking of a Black individual, a Latina individual, et cetera, in stereotypical ways. The second tool or practice is priming. So I want you all to do this with me, and you may mute yourselves, don't unmute, because there's some hearing sensitivity sometimes and it could get very loud. If you can say top 10 times. So let's start. Top, 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 top. What do you do at a green light? You don't, I saw you all. I saw William. You don't stop, you go, right? But I just did the practice. It's priming you to say what I want you to say. And we get a lot of messaging through that, right? A lot of ads, a lot of marketing is done this way, so be careful. So fill in the missing word. On the left, we have red, blue, orange, yellow, and green, because they're colors, right? There's the category. And then on the right, we have plum, nectarine, pear, apple, and grape, because they're fruits, right? There's a million different choices, but I'm priming you to think of a specific category, right? This is very also useful because we have a tendency, as we learned, to categorize everything. So if we respond to that tendency based on previous knowledge and expectations, we can also kind of like navigate behavior and nudge people to behave in certain ways. We can use priming techniques like imagery, signs, short videos, objects, and cues in the environment for behavior change. Then we have, and I'm about to wrap this and let you go, engage in meaningful intergroup interactions. So engaging in positive and meaningful interactions with members of other groups you don't belong to. That is amazing. And I'm sure you all know this. This is a pretty common sense strategy, but it is evidence-based and it's proven to be effective. It doesn't mean that you're going to walk in front of someone you don't know and ask very personal questions. Obviously, you have to have a relationship, but seek those relationships. Listen to understand, right? Expand your own awareness and understanding of different experiences. And that can really start to create new mental associations, new understandings in your brain. Flip the goal is really about going against the common, very much stigma-based perspective, right? So it's taking a new perspective about something that we commonly stereotype. So for example, men and women, we expect women to be supportive, sensitive, emotional, fragile, helpful. Well, let's flip that. Let's say men are supportive, sensitive, emotional, fragile, and helpful, right? Because they are. So not placing one single thing on one gender just for the mere fact of social stereotypes. And then on the right, you have other examples. Police officer is a very gender non-neutral language, and we use male-based language to generalize all people together. And so that is also a thing that we can change. And sports, Cleveland Indians, definitely using culture for materializing a lot of just money agendas, right? And not having to take culture for that. So flipping it here, Cleveland Caucasians, and how that may seem as the dominant culture, Caucasians, white, and seeing how that shifts our thinking and our perspective, right? And then lastly, we have community engagement versus outreach. And engagement is what we propose from an equity standpoint, because outreach historically has been used to reach out from the outside in. I come with my agenda. I have self-interest. I have my own things that I have to get done. I either need a study, I need information from you, I need something from you, and then I leave, right? That's outreach. It's temporary. I have all the support and assistance you need, so I'm bringing you all that information. And it's a one-way approach. I think that I'm saving people, and ultimately I design everything. I design programs, policies, procedures without your take, without community's perspective, without your direction. And that's not what we are about. We're about engaging, working collaboratively, knowing that the other community members on the end of community, not, I work for state government, so not government in my case, right? We don't have all of the knowledge. We don't have all the solutions and all the information necessary. Community has knowledge. Community has wisdom. Community knows what will work in their community, right? They have direct experience. So we should have an ongoing relationship. We should have a mutual beneficial relationship, and come up with ways that are practical and that will be successful in that particular community together, because we don't have all the answers. We have to co-decide with community as full partners in that process, right? So engagement is what we need. And now, this is the call to action. Now that we have reviewed all of that, I want you to walk away from this workshop using an implicit bias framework, right? So reflect on, how do you experience bias in yourself and at work? How does bias impact the people that you serve? And how does it impact your own lives and your family's lives, right? And then in order to practice what we learned, because don't think that it's just automatic, we have to practice and we have to bring it into our daily lives. Try to go back to the 5 strategies to reduce biases and choose 1 or 2 that you can implement on a weekly basis for the next 2 months. It means that maybe you have it in front of you in your work area, at your home, and you see it. And every week you're like, okay, how have I thought about this week? What has happened? Let me reflect and be intentional. And maybe if it happens again, this is my plan. This is what I'm going to do, right? Be very intentional with how you're going to counter your biases. Write those intentionalities, write as much details as possible so that next time it happens, you have a plan. This is what improves us as humans, right? Having forethought, having reflection and intention, and then share with your colleagues or a friend so that you have accountability, so that you're like, oh, I have to be responsible for this because I shared this. Because sometimes we're very well intended, but we may be very busy, maybe we forget, and maybe we need that accountability partner, right? If you have anything right now, whether it's your own thoughts about a practice that you will use to reduce bias, if you have questions, if you want to chat with me, I'm here. Thank you very much for being with us today. We will send information out to you on what we shared today. And this is just the beginning. I hope you like the topic and you become curious with it. Okay, I am going to check the chat to see if you have any questions. Okay, perfect. Great, I'm glad. I'm sorry that we ran over. I hope that didn't conflict with your plans. Perfect, very glad. If you don't have any questions, drop a word in the chat, a word that explains how you're feeling right now. With my siblings, interestingly, I am an only child. I'll stop your stereotypes right now. But yes, I'm an only child, so I haven't used it with siblings, but I have used it with family. And I can tell you it is harder to use it with loved ones than it is to use it with collegial relationships, because feelings are involved, because you don't want to harm your love. You don't want to say the wrong thing and hurt someone mistakenly, right? So I have to walk more delicately in those interactions, but I do. Okay, perfect. All right, so here's my information. I know that they're closing this, so you can do a next section or a next training session. And we will post these on the website as well. So thank you so much and have a great rest of your conference.